All right. Good evening. Screwed it up already. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Edward and Regina Rechnic Holocaust Speaker Series at the University of Southern Indiana. I'm Dr. Todd Schroer. I am the coordinator of the series, which was established by Irene Rechnic in honor of her parents, whose experiences during the Holocaust reflect both the profound losses as well as the resilience of those who survived that time period. Edward and Regina lived under impossible conditions while imprisoned at Auschwitz-Birkenau and survived a brutal death march when the camps were empty due to the advance of the Allied forces. To give Irene a better chance at survival, they entrusted her to a Catholic family to be raised as their own. Luckily, while most of their relatives did die, if you've seen the pictures over there, they survived. Living through these devastating times ingrained in Irene a dedication to educating our community in the hopes that we will never forget. To further that aim, shortly before she died, Irene established this series to share personal stories, historical insight, and scholarship so that the Holocaust is not reduced to distant memory, but understood as a human reality with lessons that matter today. In this vein, I am pleased to announce to you that beginning this spring, we'll be expanding our impact with a Holocaust film series to further deepen understanding through visual storytelling and discussions. So look forward to that, hopefully, coming soon. Thank you for being here tonight and supporting this ongoing commitment to remembrance and learning. I would like to now introduce Charlie Berger, who will be introducing our acclaimed speaker, Dr. Wolf Gruner.
Thank you, Professor Schroer. I really don't need a mic. I got such a loud mouth. It's an honor to be here tonight, and it was an honor when Irene asked me to be in charge of the trust for this speaking series. I'd like to say a lot of things about her, but it's not about her tonight. It's about what the legacy she left and all of you being here to hear a really fabulous person speak about something we hope never happens again. Now, I will have to say that Todd plays a key role in my introduction because he did the speech writing for me. Now, I'm going to vary from it a little bit, because one thing he didn't do is he didn't go out and try to find out what Professor Gruner students thought about him, but I did. Having been a professor before at USI, I got online and checked, and he's a fabulous person and a fabulous teacher. I love Professor Gruner. He is an awesome guy, very knowledgeable and passionate about the Holocaust. It is a book heavy, so prepare to read a lot. Now that's a really honest appraisal of some students that really wanted to learn. So we're very fortunate tonight, and I want to thank all of you for being here. There are students, educators, neighbors, friends. Tonight we gather not just to learn about history, but to reflect on courage, dignity, and the power of resistance. When we think of Jewish resistance during the Holocaust, we often imagine dramatic uprisings or daring escapes. But Dr. Wolf Gruner invites us to look closer, to see the quiet, everyday acts of defiance that unfolded in Nazi Germany. A teenager refusing to wear the yellow star, a shopkeeper helping a neighbor in secret, a mother shielding her child from persecution. These stories aren't just historical footnotes. They're reminders that resistance can take many forms and that ordinary people, like all of us, can make extraordinary choices. Dr. Gruner is the Shapell, and I probably butcher all these names. I model myself on speech after George Bush in Jewish Studies at USC, and the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. His work has uncovered hundreds of overlooked acts of Jewish resistance, challenging the myth of passivity and restoring agency to those who lived through the horror and resisted under the Third Reich. And why does this matter today? Because we still live in a world where authoritarianism, anti-Semitism, and injustice persist. Because silence in the face of oppression is never neutral. It's very true so today. And because learning how people resisted in the past can hopefully inspire us to stand up, speak out, and support one another. So whether you're here to learn, reflect, or be moved, you are in the right place. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wolf Gruner.
Thank you so much, first of all, for the kind invitation to Schroer, the whole University of Southern Indiana. And I'm pretty happy to talk about things we practically excluded from our kind of memory of the Holocaust. And I have to include myself because I think I'm a kind of specialist on especially the persecution of German Jews, and for many years I was not aware of the topic what I'm talking about today. So what I will do in this lecture, I will first talk about one story, which is part of the book. Then I will explain a little bit why we have forgotten what these ordinary Jews did. And then at last, I will share with you an overview of the different kinds of resistance, the different forms I came across in my research over the last 12 years. So let me share with you the one story. We have to go back to the year 1940. This was the second year of the Second World War. We are in Germany, in the big city of Frankfurt in Hesse, and a young teenager, a Jewish teenager, his name was Hans Oppenheimer, left every night his apartment building and broke the curfew, which was introduced a year earlier for Jews, and disappeared into the night. You have to imagine the night was pitch black because there was a brownout against the Allied bombers. So after a while, he kind of waited in kind of an entrance of a building until Allied bombers circled in on Frankfurt. And when they started to drop their bombs, and he heard explosions, and the sirens went off of the fire alarm, he rushed to the next fire alarm post, hit the button, and set off a fire alarm, but the wrong one, because there was no burning house. So he did this not just once, he did this frequently. And it's interesting to think about why is a Jewish teenager setting off these wrong fire alarms? And how did he get there, right, to do this? which was quite kind of dangerous for him because there was police patrolling at night and so on. So he was the firstborn son of a Jewish merchant family in Frankfurt. The father had a store which kind of sold accessories to tailors in Frankfurt. They had a good living. They had a nice kind of spacious apartment in one of the better kind of areas in Frankfurt East End, where a lot of Jewish families lived. In 1933, when Hitler came to power, he was graduating from elementary school, Hans Oppenheimer, I mean, and he was then enrolled into a private Jewish school because his parents felt that he was better protected in a private Jewish school than in a public school. He graduated from middle school with very good grades in 1937, and at this moment he could have kind of gone to high school in the same private Jewish school, but he decided to leave the school and kind of get an apprenticeship. And this for two reasons. The first one was that he wanted to kind of help his family on a short-term base because his father had lost his job in the meantime. The family was depending on public welfare. And the long-term reason was that he didn't see any future in Germany, and he thought an apprenticeship with a practical profession would help him to have better chances to emigrate and find kind of a future somewhere else. And this was because since 1933, anti-Jewish laws and decrees had kind of really deteriorated the situation for Jews in whole Germany, but specifically in Frankfurt. Frankfurt was the place with the second biggest Jewish community in Germany. And the new Nazi mayor already in March 1933 started to introduce the first discriminatory decrees. He cut business ties to Jewish shops on behalf of the municipality. He dismissed Jewish employees from the municipality. And he, in 1936, the city of Frankfurt reduced the benefits for poor Jews, which also affected the family of Hans Oppenheimer. So he went to a Jewish vocational school, which was just recently established in 1936, kind of with the purpose to help Jewish teenagers to get a kind of apprenticeship so that they have better chances to emigrate. He learned kind of the profession of a blacksmith there, and when he finished, he went to the labor office in Frankfurt. This was in March 1939, a few months after Kristallnacht. He just wanted to find a job, but the labor office recruited him for kind of forced labor to one of the very first forced labor camps inside Germany. This was the first forced labor program against Jews, which first targeted unemployed Jews like Hans Oppenheimer. He was still 16 years old, very young. So the camp was one of several camps which were established in the course of the next months and years in Germany. And in summer 1939, this was before the start of the Second World War, already 20,000 Jewish men had to perform heavy forced labor, mostly road construction and this kind of street cleanings, so heavy manual labor. And Hans Oppenheimer, as a 16-year-old, was one of them. He would not see his family for months, and from this labor camp, he was transferred to another labor camp, which was closer to his hometown, but he would not see his family anyways, because at this time, new rules against Jews forbid that they had any type of vacation during their forced labor stints. Moreover, this new camp was in a town where the mayor was heavily anti-Semitic, And he ordered frequent beatings of the forced laborers. They had to be segregated from the town population. And remember, this was all kind of before the war. The kind of conditions were so bad that one of the men committed suicide in this labor camp. So he was there for several months, and from there, he was then, after a while, released and sent back to Frankfurt. So because of his early kind of experiences of the discrimination against his family, his own personal experiences as a forced laborer at this young age, he came back to Frankfurt, and this is the moment where he decided to do something. So he left his family home every night to break the curfew and to set off wrong fire alarms until one night on December 10th, 1940, when he was caught red-handed just before he wanted to hit the button again. So he was arrested by the Gestapo, was put in prison in a pre-trial detention, and in April 1941, the main prosecutor in Frankfurt charged him with several felonies according to the criminal code, as well as offenses under the war decree against so-called public vermins. The written indictment characterized him as a full Jew, and the prosecutor pointed out that according to the Gestapo's assessment, Hans was unstable, lazy, and think about it, he had already like 18 months or so of forced labor under his belt, and that he was a dishonest human being who only was eager to destroy things. Under interrogation by the Gestapo, Hans had only admitted to 9 acts of setting off wrong fire alarms. However, the prosecutor suspected that he was responsible for way more, because there was a series of 44 wrong fire alarms in the neighborhood where Hans lived. And so the series ended miraculously when he was arrested. So there were attempts to try him for treason, which would have meant that he actually would have received the death penalty. But they could not establish legal grounds for this. And so in the end, he was brought before the Frankfurt Special Court, charged with 9 cases of malicious acts, and was tried. During the trial, there was no defense lawyer present. He defended himself, and he was just turning 18 at the time of the trial. In the end, the special court punished him with 3 years in prison for being a public vermin, sabotaging the war effort. Fortunately, the judge did not follow the recommendations of the prosecution to apply adult law because he had done the act at the age of under 18. And the judge, nevertheless, emphasized in his verdict that Hans should have acted differently. He should have paid special attention to the law because he was only a guest in Germany as a Jew. From there, he was in June 1941 transferred to a small prison away from his hometown. And from the first day on, he was isolated, put in in a solitary confinement, as it was called. And over the next months in isolation, without any contact to other prisoners, this situation took a really heavy toll on him. His only lifeline were letters to his family, or letters from his family. And he begged his parents to visit him there, and he also begged for medication because there was no kind of medical attention in the prison, and he had developed like very painful teeth cavities, and also skin rashes, which were itching and driving him crazy. He did not know that many of his letters did not end up with his parents. They were shelved by the prison warden for being too outspoken about the bad prison conditions. Despite his struggles, kind of physically and also emotionally, he did not back down. Several times he tried to petition the prison warden about these terrible conditions in prison. And kind of word got out to his parents that he was so rebellious in prison that they asked him in one letter, you should kind of be quiet, you should back down, otherwise it will not end well. And he wrote back in one of these confiscated letters and said, look, to his parents, look, when I look at my life, I can go crazy. And he told his parents, you know best that I never had the chance to even go to a cinema or a theater or a cabaret, because from kind of, as being a teenager, right into a forced labor camp. The conditions went so bad and his kind of deterioration, in the end, he tried to commit suicide twice, unsuccessfully in prison. He was saved by guards. And at the end of 1942, after more than 18 months in prison, he was transferred after an agreement between the Reich Justice Ministry and the head of the SS that kind of removed all Jewish prisoners from prisons to Auschwitz. So he was transferred to Auschwitz, and because of his weakened state, physically and emotionally, he didn't survive for long. A few weeks later, his death is recorded in Auschwitz on January 30th, 1943. This was just a few days after he had turned 20 years old. So, what can the story of Hans Oppenheimer and others reveal about the individual responses of Jews during the Nazi persecution? When we read like Nazi documents, we read a lot about the so-called impudent Jews. For example, in March 1935, the Gestapo in Aachen reported, quote, the number of Jews who had sent letters and protested in person has become quite numerous, and in their tone often impudent, end of quote. Even during the war, like at the time when Hans Oppenheimer set off the wrong fire alarms, the Reich Main Security Office of the SS in Berlin emphasized that it had received information from all corners of the Reich about the impudent attitude of the Jewish population. Historians, like myself, we always thought this frequent mentioning of impudent Jews was just a pretext to radicalize persecution. But I think we have to assess this. It was not just Nazi rhetoric. For example, in July 1935, in a report for Berlin, the Gestapo emphasized that Jews were born with disrespect for state authority. In the same months, more than 100 Jews were arrested in Berlin for being challenging state authority. Years later, during the war in 1941, there was again reports circulating about the impudent attitude of Jews. This was a time when there were more than 1,200 Jews imprisoned in different kind of jails throughout the Reich. If we correlate the number of Jews imprisoned for challenging state authority with the number of the remaining Jews who were not deported yet, we come to a kind of a relationship which would be, when you take the US population, the entire US population of 330 million, it would mean 6 million people would be imprisoned for resistance. That's quite a number. So the frequent complaints about the impudent Jews point to a forgotten reality of widespread acts of resistance by individual Jews. My systematic research over 12 years revealed that hundreds and hundreds of Jewish men and women did resist the Nazi persecution in different ways. Because of the rediscovery of these forgotten acts, we need to kind of reassess what Jewish reactions during the Nazi persecution actually meant. My research strongly challenges the idea that Jews in general, but particularly German Jews, did not resist, that they were passive towards the persecution. And I think that we have to give up this traditional idea of Jewish passivity. I see two main reasons. One is a conceptual, kind of a very reduced or narrow approach, which we had before. And the other one is that we operated with a very limited set of sources, actually, for our accounts. So let me first talk about the conceptual approach. Since 1945, historians have discussed resistance only in terms of group resistance, organized resistance, and armed resistance. Already kind of at the end of the war and the beginning of the first years after the war, there were historians kind of challenging this assessment. But in the end, most academics, like historians, settled on that resistance was rare and it was armed and it was happening in Eastern Europe, not in Germany proper. So a systematic evaluation of individual resistance never really happened. And this despite of voices of survivors, for example, from Israel, who emphasized kind of individual forms of resistance. So what I did in my research is trying to broaden the concept, the definition of resistance, to include individual acts of resistance. And this is not original. As I mentioned, there were Israeli scholars already pointing this out in the 1950s and 60s. But also in Germany, there was a Jewish historian, Helmut Eschwege, and in Australia, another Konrad Kviet, who already tried in the 1980s to kind of open up this definition. And actually, like these types of kind of individual resistance were discussed also when people in the 1980s talked about general resistance against the Nazis. Or if you look at other areas in world history, for example, it resonates with accounts by the anthropologist James Scott, or with scholars working on US slavery. So let me share my definition. So what I did here is I use a very commonly used definition by Yehuda Bauer, the prominent Israeli historian who recently passed away, and I just added individual to it. And I think this changes everything. So let me kind of explain this a little bit closer. It qualifies also like things like disobeying laws, public protest. And I think it is especially justified because Jews in Nazi Germany were kind of exposed not only to special legislation, but also to racist persecution. So Jews were especially vulnerable. So when we apply this different lens with this broader definition, then just looking at images is already different. So this photo you find in books, and usually it's taken as illustrating the terror of the first weeks by the stormtroopers. This is in the center, this is Michael Siegel, a Jewish lawyer in Munich, and they cut his pants off and drag him through the city. Usually it's taken as kind of a result of random terror. But when we look closer, he has a sign around his neck which says, "I won't complain at the police station anymore." What he actually did was he tried to release a client of his from the police station who had been arrested. So it was not random, it was targeted. Or this picture. I use this picture in my classes to illustrate city government initiatives against Jews. But then, after I started with my research, I looked at this picture and looked at her body language. Why is she actually taking a picture in front of kind of these exclusionary signs there. Or here, the Marx family. This is a picture which the son smuggled out of Germany. They took this picture the day after Nazis smeared the notorious anti-Jewish slogan at the wall of their home in a small village in West Germany. And this is the favorite picture of mine, which is on the cover of the book. This is Lizzie Rosenfeld in Vienna. She is sitting on a bench, and I don't know who reads German here. I translate this for you. It says, only for Aryans. So it means not for Jews. Lizzie Rosenfeld is Jewish. She lets her friend take a picture to document the act of defiance, and then she smuggles the negative out, and that's how it ended up in the US Holocaust Museum. So you see that already just looking at pictures changes our kind of assessment to a great deal. So what I did in my research is I used a micro-historical approach where I looked at local archives in a dozen of German cities like Hamburg, Berlin, Frankfurt, Munich, but also Vienna. And I discovered not only kind of documents in these local archives, which are evidence for individual acts, but also photographs. This photograph shows you the interior of a home in Nuremberg, which is taken by the Jewish inhabitant, or the Jewish how can I say this, the Jewish tenant of this home. The home was destroyed during Kristallnacht. So he documents the crime, which is also an act of defiance in itself. This is, by the way, the topic of my next book, which is about the overlooked mass destruction of Jewish homes during Kristallnacht, which I think had an enormous impact on the Jewish population and kind of made many realize that there is no future in Germany. So my research unearthed kind of a huge variety of different news sources. Many are from police records, trial records, but also, as I showed, images. And I added 170 interviews from the USC Shoah Foundation, so interviews with survivors, to my source base. So for the rest of the time, let me give you some overview of the kind of different types of resistance. Since I found so much unexpectedly, I had to come to terms to find some order for it. And this is what I came up with. So you have first contesting Nazi propaganda, anti-Jewish propaganda, then oral and written protest, disobedience or kind of ignoring laws, and then physical self-defense. And I give you some examples for each of the categories in the remaining time. So contesting Nazi propaganda. So from the very first day, there were Jews who kind of ripped down Nazi flags, who destroyed anti-Jewish posters. They besmeared displays of anti-Semitic newspapers. And this goes on for the next kind of years and doesn't end even in the war years. The story I want to share is one of the chapters in the book. This is the story of David Bornstein. He was a middle-aged man, a merchant in Hamburg, and on a very nice summer day, he accompanied his wife to a bus station, a bus terminal at the outskirts of Hamburg, because she wanted to visit her parents, his parents-in-law, and so he brought her there. She kind of hops on the bus. The bus is not departing yet, so he is waiting and he's talking to her. While he's talking from outside the bus through the window to her, he tries to destroy the swastika logo on the public bus. And this is a Gestapo blow-up photo of how he tried to scratch the swastika with his walking cane. I hope you can see that there are 3 long scratches over the swastika. Can you see this in the back? So he was denunciated by a bus driver of a different bus who witnessed this. He was put on trial. He got sentenced for several weeks in prison for trying to practically destroy an official Nazi logo here. And when he was released, he later was actually again arrested and put in a concentration camp because in 1938 there was a raid against Jews with a criminal record. And he had a criminal record for trying to destroy the swastika. After he got out of the concentration camp, he left with his wife and his newborn daughter, young daughter, for Palestine. And this is kind of a first example of historical reenactment. Here in front, you see a the bus conductor actually, who denunciated David Bornstein, kind of impersonating David Bornstein, how he tried to scratch the swastika. And the supposed wife is actually a Gestapo officer in the window. Okay, all protest. So really interesting is that the majority of my evidence is actually speaking out against persecution. This was also surprising because I thought with the terror of the first weeks, not many Germans would speak out, much less Jews. And it starts like right in 1933 that Jews kind of criticized the first wave of terror, the kind of beating up of Jews in the streets or in concentration camps. And then throughout the years, Jews spoke up in restaurants, offices, in their kind of apartment buildings. And one of the examples, this is the main story in the book, is the story of Henriette Schäfer. Maybe I go back first. Henriette Schäfer was kind of a 50-year-old woman, and she left her house at the morning after the Kristallnacht, after the violence pogrom. She enters a shop and asks the store owner, so, quote, "What are you saying about the fact that everything is being destroyed and the synagogues are arsoned?" End of quote. So the shop owner responds along the official Nazi party lines, "Oh, this is the outrage of the German people because of the assassination of our diplomat in Paris." And Henriette Schäfer replied, quote, No, this is not the people, but the government. They are all blackguards, scums, and criminals. Hitler is the biggest bandit. If I could, I would poison them all." End of quote. She received 6 months in prison for this comment. And she received these 6 months under the law, which I just posed here, the law from 1934 against treacherous attacks against the Nazi state, which was used to kind of silence a lot of public protests, and we never knew that this was also applied to Jews. We thought it was for communists and social democrats. And even during the war, Jews spoke up. So for example, Hertha Reis, she was a 36-year-old woman toiling as a forced laborer in Berlin. She's exclaimed in front of a Berlin courthouse, quote, "We lost everything. Because of the damned government, we finally lost our home too. This thug Hitler, the damned government, the damned people. Just because we are Jews, we are discriminated against." End of quote. This is 1941 in kind of. And we don't know, unfortunately, what happened to her, so I couldn't establish evidence. However, what I don't know is a similar case from Vienna, from this Gabriele Reich, who insulted Hitler in public, who criticized the persecution in Vienna, and also listened to forbidden international radio broadcasts. And she received 10 months in prison for this. So written protest is an interesting part of the story. It ranges from petitions, where we have a lot of evidence of petitions, and we saw them. We didn't take them really seriously because we thought they were written in vain anyways. However, when you look closely at these petitions, it is not only that Jews asked for being exempted from some laws or from some regulations, they often also try to reclaim their identity as Germans, as contributors to the homeland, as German citizens. So there is also a message involved in many of these petitions. So this is one part of the story, but the other part is there were also anonymous leaflets Jews would kind of send in, mail in, put in mailboxes and so on. So for example, in Berlin in summer 1935, there were anti-Jewish kind of demonstrations. And some shop owners were harassed and they wrote petitions to the police president. But one Jew did actually something different. He wrote a kind of a leaflet, anonymous, and I quote from the leaflet, "Germany is a cultural disgrace today. I'm a German Jew and loyal to the emperor. In fact, the Germans should expel the foreigner Hitler. Down with Hitler," end of quote. And this is not the leaflet, but the police report about it. So even during the war, many Jews complained about the persecution in writing, and the most kind of, how can I say this, impactful story is the story of Benno Neuberger. So Benno Neuberger was a former real estate broker in Munich. He was 70 years old, so he was retired. He had lost his real estate business already during inflation, so not because of the Nazis, but he could still live on some of the income from this time. And then after 1933, he witnessed like the increasing persecution. His two children, his daughter and his son, left very soon for America. And Benno Neuberger and his wife, Anna, they tried to follow, but they could not make it out of Germany. So they witnessed everything, Kristallnacht, the violence, they tried endlessly to get out. They kind of missed the marriages of their children in the United States, the birth of their grandchildren. And in the end, the war had started. They realized they could not get out. And when the Yellow Star was introduced in 1941, Benno Neuberger decided that he would do something. So he wrote anonymous postcards which he sent into the mail, and he insulted Hitler, and these are some of the postcards. He wrote like more than a dozen of them, and since I need to translate this for you. So on the left side it says, "The eternal murderer Hitler, disgusting!" exclamation mark. On top it says, "The bestie, the murderer, the bandit," and then you see a cross across the Hitler post stamp. So he wrote always about across the Hitler post stamps. And then the last one is the most prophetic one. It says, "Murderer of 5 million." He made one mistake. He used one of the postcards from his former real estate firm. And that's how the Gestapo got a hold of him. He was interrogated. He was tortured. This is the Gestapo photo. And if you look closely, you can see that he has a bruise under his eye. Yeah. So he was then brought from Munich to Berlin, and then he was tried at the notorious People's Court, so the most notorious propaganda court. And he stood there, and he was asked why he did these things, why he would write these postcards. And he said, and this is really, you have to kind of think about this. In front of the People's Court in Berlin, he said, "Because I hate Hitler, because of what he did to the Jews, the persecution of the Jews, the anti-Jewish kind of propaganda, and also, and this is interesting, the announcement that Hitler wants to exterminate the Jews, which he did in one speech in January 1939. So, as we can expect in front of the People's Court, he received the death penalty and he was beheaded in September 1942. So defying laws had a wide spectrum. Hans Oppenheimer is one of them. I want to pick one interesting, unexpected example. You all probably heard of that Jews had to adopt middle names, discriminatory middle names, Sarah and Israel, so that they could be identified. Interesting thing is, I thought always they were just obliged to do this was automatic. It was not. The German name law requests that you fill out a form, that you pay 3 Reichsmark, and then you request the name change yourself. So interestingly, there were quite a few Jews in the city archives I found which never applied for this, didn't fill out these forms. So they never adopted these names, and then sometimes a year later, sometimes months later, sometimes 2 years later, they were discovered randomly that they have never applied, that they would not carry this name. So again, for this tiny thing, not kind of requesting, they ended up in jail and in prison and for several months. So for example, in Leipzig, the 73-year-old Ida Schneider had not applied for the name change, but also not for the kind of marked ID card Jews had to carry. So she was detected only in 1941. The name change request was in 1939. So she survived 2 years in Leipzig. And then she received a 7-month prison sentence for this crime. Similarly, many refused to wear the yellow star, which was also punished with jail sentences if you were caught. And one last example is from Max Mannheimer. This is the only evidence I found in the diary because people avoided to talk about in their letters or in their diaries what they did. He did, and he said, quote, "My home is in a wooden hut behind a tool shed." He was a forced laborer at the time. "From there I go to the public park. Despite the 8 p.m. curfew and despite to ban to visit the park. On my way, I count the signs with the slogan, 'Forbidden for Jews.' In total, there are 6. Later, at 11 p.m., I rip the signs out of the ground and throw some of them into the bushes and some of them into the creek. However, all my courage proved futile. The next evening, all the signs had reemerged. And for a second time, I just did not have the courage. I am not a hero." End of quote. I mean, just let this sink in. He went back, broke the curfew again, broke the ban to visit the park again, just to check what happened to the signs. This is pretty courageous, I would say. So the last category is the most surprising, which is physical self-defense. So from the beginning, there is evidence, but interestingly, not in the archives. Most of my evidence here is from the testimonies of the Shoah Foundation, from survivors themselves. And they tell stories how teenagers defended themselves against verbal insults and physical attacks against kind of from Hitler Youth, neighborhood kids. Interestingly, I found 30 testimonies where they talk about these attacks by teenagers. And from these 30 testimonies, 11 were actually from girls at the time. So girls would kind of defend themselves physically against male assailants or also female assailants. And there are stories where Jewish men defended neighbors, kind of beating up stormtroopers who had harassed their neighbors. And the story I want to share with you is the story of Daisy Gronowski. She has an interview in the Shoah Foundation. She was at the time 16 years old, and the time is Kristallnacht. She was originally from Berlin, moved to a retraining camp where she got agricultural kind of education so that she can emigrate more easily as a teenager to a foreign country. most of the retraining camps across Germany were raided and destroyed during Kristallnacht, which we also don't think often about. So she describes now in her video testimony how the stormtroopers raided the camp.
The kids, you know, the youngsters, and the boys, they were bleeding. And then all of a sudden, I came my turn. I said, hell, I'm not going to run. I'm going to walk. Here I am. I mean, 5'0", I'm 5'1", 5'0", and I'm a skinny little girl. And all of a sudden, it wasn't any fun anymore. And I remember getting one on the back, and that was it. I just walked through very slowly, looking at all of them. Now here, big, tough guys. You want to hit a little girl? What can I do about it? You know, it's the attitude. And I only got hit by one on the back, it hurt. And I got to the end of the line, one of them grabs me, grabs this hand, my right hand, and starts sawing into it with a rusty knife. Pocket knife type thing. Well, I'd learned a little trick, and that's sticking my head into someone's stomach, which doesn't feel great. And I turned around to see what I could do with him, and I started fighting, and I started kicking with my legs, his legs. He wasn't very big either, and he was young. Anyway, I finally managed to get my head out and under the knife. I twisted the knife out of his hand. I used the knife, I stabbed him, and I dug my head into his stomach. I don't know how I did it. It was just a fast thing that they had told me. And the others didn't notice it. So a couple of the guys, the others were too busy, beaten up on the film. So a couple of the guys saw it, and they dragged him underneath a bed, or some kind of a sofa type thing that hadn't been kicked over so the others wouldn't see him. He was bleeding. He wasn't dead, but he was bleeding. Anyway, that's when we took off. We ran, all of us. And they started covering after, then give up on it.
So just to explain you a little bit, so she was 16 years old at the time. She had kind of talks a little bit about a trick. This was actually a jiu-jitsu trick, which she was taught back in Berlin, where she was a member of a Hashomer Hatzair group. And they had self-defense training there. And she was like 12 or 14 when she received the self-defense training. So this explains a little bit how she was able to do this. She then escapes, she's got caught again, she escapes again, and finally makes it out with the Kindertransport to England because she was able to get to the Jewish community in Cologne, which immediately sent her to London. And that's how she got out and survived. So I think when we, and this is my conclusion, when we think about kind of resistance in a very different way, including individual, not only group actions, it really changes our perspective. We see an enormous amount of courageous individual acts, and I want to just add to this, what I presented here is only a kind of a part of the story. Because I was a one-man show, I had limited time in the archives because I taught at USC. So it was summers and sometimes conferences where I added some days in the archives. So there are many archives still untouched in Germany, which I haven't seen. There are many testimonies still to watch. And then it is not just Germany and Austria, it is also Bohemia, Moravia, and other occupied countries. And then some of the acts never left traces in the archives, as I learned from the testimonies of the Shoah Foundation. Yeah, they tell stories which are not kind of, there's no evidence in the archives about this. So as I shared with you, one can kind of, in a way, use 5 categories to kind of describe these different acts of individual resistance. And I want to highlight that my research focusing on individual acts also did something which is not common. When people think about resistance, there are two assumptions. People are young and mostly male. And my research shows quite a different picture. Many elderly people actually resist, as you saw with Benno Neuberger, for example, but also many women. And not just many, it was actually an equal amount women than men. Yeah, so in some areas, like public protest, I found more evidence by women because they were more in the streets, especially in the 1930s. But then in physical self-defense, it was a little bit more men. And so there are some kind of trends, but in general, there is no difference when we think about age. There's no difference when we think about gender. There's no difference when we think about like education. There's no difference when we think about upbringing. So all like theories about what enables somebody to actually resist are kind of in a way disappearing, because what my research shows, anybody can do it if the circumstances are there and the will to do it. So but some might and kind of question, are these small acts really resistance? Yeah? I mean, sometimes it's just writing a note on a piece of paper. But think about this in the terms, it's not about, let's say, the victims themselves, if they see this as resistance, and they usually don't see it as resistance. In the testimonies of the Shoah Foundation, they never claimed that this was resistance. But it's also not upon us scholars to decide what is actually real resistance or not real resistance. In the end, it is about the ones who, the perpetrators themselves. If they perceived a small note on a piece of paper as threatening and punish the person who kind of wrote this with jail or even with death penalty, then there's no way that we can't say this is not resistance. So I think it's really important that these types of resistance, like the story of Hans Oppenheimer, need to be incorporated in our standard kind of Holocaust narrative. And I think it is applicable also to other areas in occupied Europe and even to other genocides. And I think what it does, this kind of different perspective, it is not just a rediscovering of forgotten acts of individual courage, but it's also showing us like the victims as historical actors with agency. Thank you.
It's all up to you. Okay. We do have some time for questions if anyone would be interested. The microphones are right there if you want to come up and ask a few questions. And he's very nice. You can ask anything. And he won't be mean or bite, but somebody I know come up and ask the first one? Okay.
I'll be brave. I'm intrepid. Thank you, Dr. Gruner, for a really, really wonderful speech and for a really great talk. I'm so glad that you brought up at the end of your talk today the role of both women and also older people in these acts of agency, these acts of resistance, and thinking more about these kind of intersectional identities, being German, being Jewish, being a woman, being elderly. I'm wondering whether you see these kinds of myriad acts of resistance across the Germans' other victim groups in Germany. And then I'm also wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about, do you envision that these examples that you're talking about in your book are specifically related to a German Jewish intersectional identity, or do you think upon closer observation in countries like, in areas like Czech Republic, Bohemia, we're going to see something similar, or is this really linked to the fact that, from at least my understanding, German Jews were very secular, very well integrated in German society? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I start with the second part. So before I wrote this book, I wrote a book about Bohemia and Moravia and the persecution of the Jews there. And I actually included subchapters about individual resistance because I found very similar acts of resistance in kind of archives regarding the kind of persecution of the Czech Jews. So very similar, also the punishment is very similar. So that's, I think, very close. I assume this will also be true for other annexed territories. Sometimes in other occupied territories, it might be a little bit different, and also the persecution is different because, let's say, the death penalty, it needed something to get the death penalty in Germany, but not so much in Poland. So they are different. And also, in Germany, they still clung to the legal system so that they would put them on trial, which might have been different in the occupied eastern territories. The other thing is, so I didn't came across, for example, of similar acts by persecuted Romani people in Germany. But what I came across is, and this is interesting, an enormous amount actually of non-Jewish Germans. And not just that they kind of criticized the regime, which they did, which we also knew from communists and so. No, but I found actually quite a large number of critique of the persecution of the Jews by non-Jewish Germans. And they were tried equally. They got equal punishment. And it's interesting that they practically get the same sentences as the Jewish kind of defendants. So that was kind of interesting to me, and this is also corroborated. I mean, I found, let's say, police logbooks where I see, you have seen pictures from Kristallnacht where you see a large mass of German spectators. When you look at the picture, you think people don't talk because we don't hear noise or anything. But when you read police logbooks, then you see that these people actually, as a large mass, they talk to each other about what happened. And some get denunciated because in these large masses, there were people pro and contra the violence. And so you have kind of people protesting against the violence, protesting against individual anti-Jewish acts, be it local or national. So this was a surprising also fact because we assumed often that there was this separation, the Jews were kind of segregated, and then there was no interaction really anymore, and most Germans would be hostile to the Jews. And that's also, it's much more complicated and much more complex. So thank you for the question.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk. Looks like you did a lot of objective research and put them in these 5 different categories. When I look at some of the school systems across the United States and kids that are affected by bullying, you could put all these 5 categories into bullying and how some react to it. If I'm a strong physical person, I would do your number 5 category. And if I'm a writer, but I'm not that, but if I'm a writer, I might do one of your postcards. But there's probably a lot of other things. Are there other analogies besides bullying that you have perceived from all your research?
Can you kind of, do you mean in relation to bullying, or do you mean, what do you?
If I'm a child and I'm being bullied, what am I going to do? I'm going to do one of those 5 things. And if I'm a Jewish person in a prison or in Germany in World War II, I'm reacting with what I know what to do, and I'm resisting punishment. Kids that are bullied today are punished by society, and it can't be solved easily. And some of them are using the same mechanisms that you have shown, those 5 categories. And so I'm wondering if there's other analogies to other systems besides bullying that you've understood that your research is analogous to many other things we see in society.
Oh, yeah, that's a very good question. And I think in a way, there are many analogies to other kind of, let's say, countries. So sometimes when I think about these small deeds, they sound so insignificant. There was this one example when the Ukraine was invaded. There was a woman in Moscow sitting on a red square with a blank sheet of paper. There was nothing written on it, and she was arrested and went to jail for anti-war propaganda. Yeah, so you see, these are kind of analogies, very small deeds in protest to kind of government measures. So I think if we look closer with this different lens, we will find this, a lot of parallels elsewhere.
So in your research, did you see a lot of, or any authority figures that were trying to show resistance whilst maybe even temporarily being in a position of power?
So if we talk about Jewish authorities, yes. There's also this kind of post-war disappointment by many survivors that the kind of Jewish leadership kind of in a way failed them, which is kind of one can understand because what happened was so tragic. But it's also a little bit, let's say, how can I say this, uninformed. Because when we look closer, not just in Germany, but also in occupied Eastern Europe, you had Jewish leadership in ghettos who really tried to do something. It depended very much on the individuals and what they feared as repercussions. In Germany itself, also people after the war kind of blamed the Jewish leadership for too much collaboration, that they practically did the Nazis' deeds. But when you look closer, you see that within their possibilities, a lot was done, and some of them actually suffered greatly for what they did. So, for example, after the Second World War started, there was the first deportation of German Jews, which was not to Poland but to France. And two Jewish leaders protested against the deportation. They both ended up in a concentration camp. So there are kind of these, let's say, more overt acts, but then there were a lot of things which I would also see as resistance. This was, for example, one, give legal advice, how you can kind of sustain your life under persecution, how you can resist in a legal way. Then also Jewish leadership tried to manipulate Nazi agencies. So for example, when my dissertation was on Jewish forced labor, so when Jews were kind of recruited for forced labor, the labor offices did this, not the Gestapo. So the Jewish community would go to the Gestapo and say, we need these Jews here, can you talk to the labor office? When the Gestapo started to deport Jews, the Jewish community would go to the labor office and say, you need to insist that you need these forced laborers so that they are not deported. So there were sometimes very subtle kind of attempts to, in a way, defy the system or play the system, which we have not fully researched yet.
Sorry, this is a great talk. I have so many questions, but I promise this is my last one. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about, it's exciting that you're already starting to think about your next book project, especially you're talking about, from what I understand, Kristallnacht through the lens of family homes that are being destroyed. And what I think is really interesting about that is, granted, I'm not an expert of Nazi Germany, but whenever I think about Kristallnacht, I think about many of the most canonic images, which are images of Jewish storefronts and more public spaces. I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit about where you're thinking about going in this new project, and maybe also situating it alongside this project. It sounds like this might be another project where you're really focusing on microhistories. Do you see it as an extension of this project, or are you going in a completely new direction?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm happy to talk about this. But I think one problem is that often in public, but even in academia, we have a very kind of simplistic understanding of what happened during the persecution. And interestingly, this very kind of simplistic understanding evolved over time. So for example, I learned about the massive home destruction watching testimonies of survivors. And I thought I knew everything about the persecution of the Jews and about Kristallnacht, and then suddenly I learned almost every home was destroyed, and I said, this can't be. Then I started to look into evidence like images and so on, and then I realized it's not just the destruction, it's also beating up of people, sexual abuse, and what is connected to this. So it opens up a very different understanding what happened during this night, but it's also not new, because the first book published on Kristallnacht in March 1939, so a few months after Kristallnacht, published in London, the first chapter is about home destructions. So why did we lose this knowledge? The same with the resistance. This was also in some way known, but why don't we know about this? So people, how we commemorate is in a way shaped by, let's say, developments after the war, sometimes trials which focus on certain aspects, and so we need to kind of complicate these stories, and I think there's also more hope in these kind of when we complicate these stories, and better understanding also. And I want to make a point with the book, because I think the destruction of home is not just that you lose, let's say, your home. It is you lose family tradition and history. You lose a present, right? A shelter, a refuge, especially for the German Jews. But you also lose a future, because you can't go back into this home when it's destroyed. So I think this is a universal question of how people are impacted when their homes are destroyed by violence. So that's what I want to talk about in this book.
First of all, apologies, I'm a philosopher. This is very much a philosopher's question. But so you had said the way we define resistance is not the intention of the resistor, but rather that the reaction is a punitive measure from the one that they're resisting. How do you distinguish between that and cases where those who are attempting to dominate others are just being random, right? They're just punishing to strike terror in the hearts of the population. So how do you demarcate when it's resistance versus not, given that sometimes they're punished and it's not meant to be in response to that particular act of resistance?
That's a good question. Maybe I was a little bit myself too simplistic here, because I think any woman or man, young or old, who did something under this umbrella, what I just described here, was conscious about the repercussions. So there is not like that they did unconscious thing and then suddenly they kind of got punished for resistance. No, they knew what they were doing. They knew about, not fully about the consequences, but that this is kind of something what they are not supposed to do. So in this regard, every of these acts is a conscious act. Yeah? So it's not that this is by coincidence or accidental. When you go into a shop and talk about, like Henriette Schäfer, it's clear that you can be denunciated. In some cases you might not, but in most cases you are. So I think it is wrong to believe they were unconsciously running into a problem. That's not, because the whole system worked in a way that they, from the beginning, tried to quell any type of resistance, first against the communists and then against the Jews. And so this whole system was kind of, in a way, shaped to quell resistance. Yeah. Can I do something before we leave, which I totally forgot? I have to make a kind of make a project known which you might be able to help with. So my center at USC is partner in a multi-institutional project which is called lastseen.org. It's a project for 3 years now, gathering the last remaining photographs of mass deportations in Germany, Nazi mass deportations. And we were able in 3 years to double the number of cities where we now have visual evidence of deportations. But it's not only to get the images, but it's also to preserve them, to analyze them, and to publish them so that you can use them in teaching and for research. So we have a website which is called Last Seen, where all the pictures we have already are there. They tell the story of the deportation. They describe, analyze the photographs, and then we also try to identify the people on these images. That means usually if you imagine a picture of a deportation, you see a group of people marched from one end to the other. You don't know who these people are. So what we try to do is to use these photographs and then identify the people who are marched. And we were able in 3 years to identify 290 people. And we tell their stories on this website. And why I'm telling you this is for two reasons, or 3 reasons actually. 1 or 4 reasons. The first is I'm actually very proud of this project. No, it won several prizes. But no, the main reason is we want to find more photographs. And we actually, I'm saying this here, because some of the images which were not known before come from the United States, because liberators took kind of trophy photos from Nazi offices. Sometimes survivors went back to Germany and the neighbor gave them an image, and said, oh, your parents are on this photograph. So I found this kind of in the Shoah Foundation testimonies. At the end, they show pictures, and one of the pictures was a photo from a small town, which we didn't know before. So the second reason is we want to kind of inform as many families who have kind of relations to the Holocaust in Germany that maybe descendants can help us to identify more people. So we kind of sometimes try to connect with families from these small towns, do kind of Zoom seminars where we talk about these photographs and try to get more details, more information. So that's kind of, and the last reason is that we really think this is kind of a tool which can be used in high schools but also in universities to teach about, let's say, the persecution of the Jews, but using images, which is very powerful but also enlightening. It broadens up who was actually participating. Did you ever think, for example, about Red Cross nurses, that they were always present at the deportation march, right? Or doctors, or bakers, because they provided bread. So it opens up a whole new perspective of who is actually involved in the deportation at this time, and maybe also in other places at other times. Thank you. And I have a flyer if somebody's interested.
All right, thank you so much for attending. Once again, we have another hand for Wolf for coming in for us. Thank you. And please join us at the reception right back there and have some food. Eat as much as you possibly can. And Wolf will be there, so ask him more questions.
Yeah, and you can contact me. You see my emails there. Thank you very much. So how do I shut this down?